now look at the sniper versus the Maroczy Bind. At one time, the Maroczy Bind was considered quite dangerous, and let's take a look. e4, c5, knight f3, g6, preparing to fianchetto our bishop, d4, c takes d4. Now, of course, we could also play a pure sniper with bishop g7. After c takes d4, knight d4. Now, one advantage of playing bishop g7 right away is that in this position, after you play c takes d4, white also has this annoying possibility with queen d4. This immediately hits the rook and takes advantage of the fact that our sniper bishop hasn't taken control of the long diagonal. So that's one thing to keep in mind. With this move order, though, cd4, in this game, white played knight takes d4. Now, white is a candidate master, about 2150, playing my training partner, Ron Wilkins, who we've seen in action before. Ron plays knight c6, immediately challenging the knight, and after c4, this is what we mentioned, the Maroczy Bind. The point is the pawns on c4 and e4, they clamp down on d5, and then this pawn also clamps down a bit on b5. Well, of course, b5 and d5 are black's two major freeing breaks in the Sicilian defense. Now, at one time, Botvinnik actually claimed that the c4, e4 setup, the Maroczy Bind, was kind of the strategical death of the black accelerated dragon situation. And he was also followed in this by the classical styles of Petrosian and then Karpov, who won many games by just squeezing the life out of their opponents. Only the Danish super grandmaster Bent Larsen actually championed the black side, and he won many games against weaker competition. But today, very effective systems have been worked out for black, and we see players such as Kramnik, Tivikov, and Topalov very gladly take up the black pieces with nice success. So, let's look at this objectively. What's the downside? Well, the downside is white spends another tempo, moving a pawn right in the early opening. The other point, though, is that the dark squares become rather weakened. And thirdly, this bishop quite often is behind its pawns. Therefore, if white's not able to gain some traction in the middle game, quite often this bishop, as we will see in some of the sample games, can become a bit of a liability or an albatross in the endgame. So let's take a look. Knight f6. This is actually the preferred move order that's recommended by Lev Albert, three-time U.S. champion, and three-time U.S. champion Roman Dzindzhinashvili in their excellent book, Chess Openings Explained for Black. And the point is, the e-pawn is attacked. After knight c3, the pawn is defended, of course, but note that knight takes, pawn takes, and then e5, trying to gain some initiative for white, simply loses a pawn after the double attack with queen a5 check. So therefore, after knight f6, knight c3, we then like the very accurate knight takes d4, and this is their point, is that the queen is forced to recapture and is drawn to the center. Of course, then you play d6. Going back, it would have been less accurate to play d6 because then after bishop e3, we now see the bishop supports the knight on d4, and after bishop g7, bishop e2, then if you exchange now or later, the white bishop is brought to d4. We'll see this in a couple of games that I will show of my own later and see how white could have taken advantage of this more favorable situation. So going back, again, if you're going to play the black side of the Maroczy Bind, the thing to do after c4 is to play knight f6, attack the pawn, and on knight c3, then exchange knights, and after queen takes, then d6. It's time to stop the pawn from advancing to e5. After bishop e2, bishop g7, bishop e3, castles. Now, of course, once black castles, he's got the idea of knight to g4, snagging the dark squared bishop. So after castles, it's time for white to move the queen with queen d2. And now the setup that is very nice, very solid for black, and recommended by Roman in his Roman Labs, and later by Andrew Martin in Foxy Openings 104, is bishop d7. The idea of this maneuver is that after f3, bishop c6, from here, the bishop is ready to chop off the knight if it emerges. It also leaves the e-pawn free to go forward, and then the queen can follow in behind. this is a very smooth and comfortable development scheme for black. For example, if he's able to play bishop c6, e6, queen e7, plan then is a5, followed by knight d7 to c5, and then some counterplay at some moment with f5. This is a very rock-solid, strategically very viable position for black. So in the game, after bishop d7, white voluntarily played f3, and after bishop c6, rook c1, and now black played a5, securing space on the queen side and making it more difficult for white to play b4, and this gains control of the c5 square. The idea now, of course, is to play knight d7 to c5. After rook to c1, a5, white played b3, black played e6, and note how the little center, as we call it, controls all of these vital squares along the fifth rank. Now here white played a4, so he really clamps down on the b5 square, but he weakens the b3 pawn and the b4 square. Black plays castles, white plays castles, and now knight d7. I really like what Ron did here. As we said, black wants to maneuver a knight to c5. But you want to be careful that your d6 pawn doesn't become too weak in the process. The point here is that Ron uses tactics to achieve his strategy. After rook at f to d1, he now plays knight to c5. And we can see this in action, because if queen d6, he's able to simply trade and then play knight takes b3, and the white queenside pawn is structure shattered, the position is open, white has numerous weaknesses. So going back after rook at f to d1, knight to c5, there's also another motif that's very important to be aware of. Instead of knight c5, you can also accomplish something similar with bishop e5. The point again is that f4 weakens the pawn on e4. You exploit this by capturing, and after rook takes, you have knight c5. Once again, attacking the pawn, and if bishop c5, d takes c5 is clearly good for black. And after knight c5, if queen d6, you simply exchange and then the knight fork. Also even better for black. So therefore, we can see that black is able to use tactics to overcome the apparent weakness of his d6 pawn. And this is actually the crux of the whole hypermodern school. This was what made the King's Indian defense, starting in the 1950s, quite popular, was once they realized that in these situations, the d6 pawn, it's only a weakness if it can be exploited. So after knight c5, in this game, white played bishop takes on c5. But after d takes c5, we now see black has control of the d4 square and a very beautiful pair of bishops. White played knight b5, looking to cover the d4 square, and after rook at f to d8, queen e1. Black now played bishop e5, and we can see the bishop starting to exert its influence. Pressures the king side, it covers the invasion squares for this white knight. White goes pawn shopping with rook d8, and then queen a5. This does push him +1 in the material count, but after queen g5, black threatens quite a bit of different penetration. The rook on c1 is on pre, he threatens to swing his rook into d2, he threatens queen e3 check. White drops back with the queen. Note that rook to d1, contesting the d-file, runs into queen e3 check, and then, if king h1, the simple rook takes, bishop takes, and b6. This is a killer deflection, hitting the queen, threatening queen e1 mate, and you'll notice all the squares are covered. Going back after queen e3 check, if king f1, then you have the very nice rook takes, and here's one of the powers of the bishops, is that at the right moment you can exchange them for some type of advantage. The point here is that after a b5, you have the devastating bishop to c3, which sets up the dual threat of bishop takes queen and queen down mate. Continuing on, after queen check, king up makes luft. You then drop back with the bishop, threatening just the simple, straightforward queen f2 mate. White has the only defense, which is to flee, and then of course check, king up, and then you could of course capture the bishop, or you could continue playing for mate with check, king up, h5, king f4. Note again, king h4, bishop f6 check is pretty nasty. And after king f4, you have a move like queen f2, simply threatening queen e3 mate. This shows the power of attacking when you have the opposite colored bishops. So going back after queen g5, white did the prudent thing and got the queen back to help try and defend. After queen e3 check, king h1, queen takes b3, we can now reassess. Black has recovered his sacrificed pawn, he's opened the board for his bishop pair, and he's exposed the white a-pawn. White secures it with a5, and then king up to g7. Again, Steinitz talked about this is one of the advantages of having the bishop pair in the middle game, is that you can start nudging your king up the board for a favorable endgame, but if the enemy tries to do the same, he will probably wind up getting into a mating attack with the two bishops. After rook b1, queen c2, white now plays knight a7, hoping to disrupt the connectivity here with the bishop and the pawn. But black powers in on the 7th rank with rook d7. After bishop f1, now bishop a4, and suddenly we see this bishop come into the game at kind of an odd angle. Knight to c8, not really clear where this guy is going, but notice of course that rook b1, as intended originally, runs smack into rook d1. So after knight c8, g5. Probably a little stronger might have been queen c3, and then on knight b6, bishop in, and on rook c1, bishop d4, and we can see white is just simply tied up in the box. h5, h4, h3 is going to break him, and it doesn't look good. But in the game, g5 was played, and g5 certainly is good. That also gains space on the king side. After knight to b6, the bishop came back home. And after rook c1, queen a2, the a5 pawn is suddenly vulnerable, and rook d1. After rook takes, and queen a5, black has a solid extra pawn, two bishops, and the knight on b6 is kind of weak. After knight d7, the powerful pin with queen d8. And here, white found the f4 to try and save the piece. And now, black played bishop d4, but the clever retreat with bishop f6, fg5, and then bishop e5 would have collected the whole piece on d7. In the game, after f4, bishop d4, knight takes e5, bishop e4. And again, we can see black has powerful bishops, two extra pawns. In fact, after queen g4, bishop f5. After bishop f5, white resigned. So let's do a quick recap. White set up the Maroczy Bind. Black played the approved move order with the immediate knight f6. After knight c3, then you exchange knights. On queen takes, you play d6, and on bishop e2, bishop g7, bishop e3 castles, and we see that white has to lose another tempo moving the queen. After queen d2, again, bishop d7, and bishop c6. This is a very nice, precise move order. You then follow with a5, securing space on the queen side, and then your choice. You can either play e6 first, followed by queen e7, and then try to bring the knight up to c5. This is a very, very solid formation for black. He has excellent counterplay, and it's very hard for white to exploit the weakness of the d6 pawn. Rook protecting, and after ef, gf, I can slide my king over and put this rook to work on the g file. So under none of these scenarios is there occupation for the rook on a8. And this is why even the games that we win, it's very important to go over to understand where we could actually improve our own play.